Welcome to this episode of Rather Than the Bars. I'm Eddie Conway, your host, coming to you from Baltimore for the Real News Network. Most of the protests in Baltimore has been peaceful, but I think we all witnessed, or at least we've heard of, the case where a woman punched the police and another police came up and punched her and knocked her to the ground. And of course, she got locked up. And since that time, her lawyer has been attempting to see her, to represent her, to get her out. He's been unable to be in touch with her. So today, we want to look at what happens to protesters that end up in jail. Up in New York, we see the state court up in New York has decided that protesters can be held in jail indefinitely. So just to look at this Baltimore case and to kind of like in general look at what's going on, we have the woman's attorney, Wyndal Gordon, to join us today. Mr. Gordon, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Can you kind of like first just talk about your client, what happened, and what's the situation there in terms of you being unable to reach her?
Well, what happened to my client is pretty much what you saw on tape. The backstory is that she was having a manic episode and she was in crisis and she needed some mental health treatment. And so that's how this whole thing kind of burgeoned into what it actually became. But I think everyone out there, including the officer responsible for taking a sucker punch and knocking her out cold, knew that she was having an episode, and no one attempted to contact crisis management. I'd like to commend the officer, actually the one who she actually struck, for exercising restraint and not resorting to excessive force to bring her under his control. But after that, after she was arrested and taken to the hospital and not receiving the mental health treatment that she needed, but taken to a hospital for her injuries, she was placed in central booking. And ever since that time, I have not been able to see her. At best, last Friday, they gave us a telephone conversation, but I cannot talk to her freely like I want to as an attorney over the telephone, and she can't communicate with me freely like she wants to over the telephone. So we just had to do the best that we could under the circumstances, but we really couldn't dig deep down into the facts to have an in-depth, thorough interview that counsel would like to have with his client. And I think that the way things are set up, it's really doing a disservice and it's violating the right to counsel, I believe. We have to advise the jails 24 hours in advance. And we had done that 24 hours in advance, and we didn't get a meeting or a jail call until 48 hours later. So I understand that everybody's trying to work their way through this pandemic. Nevertheless, there are fundamental rights that still are available to our clients that they can, make accommodations for, and that they refuse to do it. I mean, there's been many times that I've gone to jails where we have to talk through a glass window. And there's nothing wrong with us being able to talk through a glass window during this pandemic. We can put on our masks, we can talk through the glass window, we can have on our gloves, we can have all the PPEs in the world to make sure everyone stays safe, including the guards. But they haven't done that. They resorted to these phone calls, and the phone calls aren't getting it for me. And I think there's a lot that needs to be done in that aspect of providing legal representation to our clients.
Well, this obviously, on video, it's an assault. It's a simple assault. Mm-hmm. Why isn't she out on bail? Why isn't she out on her own reconnaissance? Why are they keeping her in custody, considering COVID-19 and the risk of catching it in jail is greater than outside? Well, why is she not on bail?
Again, the whole issue of bail and pretrial release falls directly on the judges. The judges had authority to release her. They have authority to place her on some type of home detention. They chose not to. So judges are just extremely heavy-handed and very protective over police officers, not because police officers can't protect themselves, because we see that they can, but it's all the criminal justice system is a live, moving organism. It's not an organization, it is an organism. And this organism protects itself. It will regenerate when it has to. It'll bite off its leg if it has to, or bite off its own tentacle, but it will protect itself at all costs. And I believe that her being in jail for 2 misdemeanors, because that's what they are, 2 misdemeanors, I believe that it's not right. And I don't feel like she should be sitting, even with her mental health situation, they should place her in a hospital. Why is she being incarcerated when everybody knows she has these issues? So we filed to have a mental health examination, and those examinations are usually required to be done in 7 days, but because of the pandemic, I've been told that it can go beyond the 7 days. So it's just creating a nightmare of issues that never before we've had to deal with. But now that we also have to always keep in mind that there's a constitution. And those of us who are so freely to give up our rights are undeserving of them. We still have to fight for our rights. Even though we're in a situation that's a pandemic, we can never give up the fight for your rights, because once you let them go, it's very difficult to get them back. So we're not going to concede to video courtrooms and doing Zoom trials with Zoom juries and all that other stuff. There's something to be said about being in that courtroom. There's something to be said about having contact with your client anytime you want to, or at any reasonable hour. There's something to be said about having that actual physical contact with the client. I mean, there's a whole lot that goes into nonverbal communication. Someone can look in your eyes and establish trust. They can look at your body language and establish distrust. I mean, there's a lot to be gained. You know, you might ask a certain question, not because someone gave you a particular answer that was responsive, but you might not have liked the way their body responded to the question. You need to be in their presence so you can judge these things. And just doing it over Zoom is not the answer. And it's not ever going to be an answer.
Up in New York, the court decided that protesters could be held indefinitely. And one of the things that I think that's happening in California, they suspended court hearings right around the time that the protests started up for a number of days. It seems that there's a concerted effort to give extra punishment to demonstrators that's protesting against police misconduct and violence. Are you aware of any other cases or any other attorneys that's having difficulty seeing their clients? And
we all are. I mean, it's not just limited to Baltimore. All over this state, I have clients in Prince George's County that I'd like to see, but it's not necessarily happening. And so, hearing about what happened in New York with regard to the protesters, I think again it has a chilling effect on speech. Like, why are you subjecting protesters to jail indefinitely? Who knows when you're going to have a hearing again? In Maryland, you're not even entitled to a trial. You won't even get a trial until August 31st, and that's a court trial. Jury trials are not scheduled to resume until October 5th. So if you have a case where you actually need a jury trial to decide the issue as opposed to a judge, you have to wait to October 5th or beyond just to see the inside of a courtroom. I have a client now who's been locked up since December 30th of 2018. We were supposed to go to trial in March, April, and May and June, and we haven't been able to go to trial. Now we're hearing that he won't even be to trial until sometime after October 5th. Why? Because cases that are scheduled for October 5th are going to have priority. And so unless those cases that are just scheduled on that day anyway go somewhere, they reset those cases, folks like my client who's been in jail for an extremely long period of time going to have a difficult time getting to trial before the end of 2020.
I see that you have represented a number of people, including Kareem Gaines.
Yes.
It seems to be difficult to get charges against police in your present case now. The police that knocked her down, your client that is, and she hit her head on the ground. There was no charges filed. Is there a dual criminal justice system in relationship to how the police charged with stuff and what happens to your clients?
Absolutely. There is a dual criminal justice system, and it's always had a disparate impact on individuals such as myself, African American males, African Americans in general, or Latino Americans, minorities in general, except for Caucasians and male and women. So when it comes to things like that, Corinne Gaines and everyone else, we have to work very hard to change the system. And right now, we're in a renaissance period, if you want to call it, maybe not a renaissance, a revolutionary period. And I'm just enjoying the fight that's going out in these streets to actually take hold of justice in this case and bring it home for people like us.
I see there's a whole lot of talk about training, police reforms, this and that. But I think there's something that actually struck a nerve was the defunding of police departments. And that discussion is going on. What do you think about the reform effort and a refunding effort?
The police reforms are definitely needed, and I definitely champion those efforts. The defunding of police, I'm not on the cheering squad or the firing squad. I do understand it. I had to do some reading up on it, because when you say defunding the whole police department, I'm like anybody else. Like if you shut down, if the police leave this city, I'm going to leave this city too. I'm not going to be in the city without any law enforcement. But at the same time, what they're talking about is not defunding. And I think that's just the clickbait. That's just the term they use to grab your attention. What they're talking about is slashing the budget. The police have some of the largest budgets of any city agency or state agency, because in Baltimore City, we talk about, they're really a state agency, but any city agency is their budget is primarily based upon law enforcement. And the new approach that I do espouse at this time is, number one, demilitarize the police. Use some of that money that you're using to buy tanks and machine guns and AR-15 rifles and all of that, and all of the little toys that you like to play with, and that you actually only use on African Americans, that I've seen. And I think history kind of lets you know that these big armored vehicles and everything, when they come to seek and destroy and not just be there for show, when they're actually being used, they're being used on us. If you recall Corinne Gaines, there was an armored vehicle parked right outside of her patio. There were 30 officers surrounding her apartment unit. There were 8 officers inside the apartment vestibule, all in full military regalia. They had pads on. They had, bulletproof vests, pads, knee pads, groin pads, helmets. They had the works. I mean, they looked like a military. I mean, and that's what they were. They looked like the army that had come in, to deal with her. And it was just completely unnecessary. And at the end of the day, one of them pulled out, Royce Ruby, that is, pulled out his AR-15 rifle and assassinated her from outside of her apartment, shot through a wall to shoot her in the back, and he was never charged. But, these types of officers who engage in that type of misconduct don't get charged in Baltimore County. The body is not worth anything to them. And when you see all these laws that we like to advocate that we should do this and we should do that, those laws only affect African Americans. Very rarely do you see white officers. And I'm not saying it doesn't happen, because it does. But you see, when a black officer does something, you'll see him hauled off in the court a whole lot sooner. If that officer who hit my client, had hit an elderly, or not even a middle-aged white woman, or sucker punched a middle-aged white woman, I don't know that he wouldn't be charged. I like to think that he either he would or he would not. I'd like to think that the decision would be the same, and I'm almost confident that under Marilyn Mosby, so I have to back up a little bit. Under Marilyn Mosby, that the decision probably would have been the same. But at the same time, I mean, we're taking a lot of beatings out here, and yeah, we need reform.
I heard you say that we have to fight to keep our rights and to protect our rights. What rights? And I understand that COVID-19 is having an impact on all institutions, but what rights do you see might be in jeopardy that we need to pay attention to?
Right to counsel, right to trial by jury, right to a speedy trial, the full panoply of constitutional rights. I think they're all in jeopardy, and they're all at stake, because once we decide that this pandemic created a situation that, you know, under these circumstances, our rights can be compromised. Once you're used to that environment, when the pandemic is over, you might expect to see these same types of issues taking place. Well, we couldn't get them to court in time because, you know, an officer was sick, or our main officer had coronavirus, even though the pandemic has passed, or for whatever reason that they consider is good enough. And I just don't think that during these tough times, I like to be able to say, even during a pandemic, we were able to honor these rights. And that's what we should be able to say in order to be beholden to our Constitution, because people are doing other things under the auspices of a pandemic. And we're out here, we're protesting, we are going to the grocery stores, we're doing everything else we have to do. So we have to not allow people to remain in jail indefinitely and then blame it on a pandemic or some other demic that causes concerns for the community.
Okay, so thanks for joining me with that update, and keep us informed if there's any additional information that we need to be aware of in regards to your client or our rights. Okay?
Thank you for having me. Indeed, thank you.
And thank you for joining this episode of Rattling the Bars.